Today, Charlie Feld and J.R. Jesson dive into the challenges of scaling Agile in large organizations. They explore how cross-functional teams, strong operating models, and clear collaboration norms can drive agility, whether teams are in person or remote. You'll hear insights on future-ready leadership, enterprise architecture, and adapting to a world transformed by AI. Now here's Charlie.
Hey, JR. I'm looking forward to this conversation today because I think there's been an awful lot of thinking on all of our models. So every piece of the architecture, from the business architecture to the technical architecture in the AI world, is becoming clearer. I think as we move into the economics of it, that's next to get solved. There are phenomenal economics, and we're looking to get out of the G&A overhead bucket and into the fabric as AI and agentic AI become part of how a company operates. It's going to create economic value, not just in the traditional overhead way, but in the operating way. And, I think the last two major fronts where big change is coming is on the organizational model and on the operating model. And I don't think we've really figured out as an industry what that really means going forward. What will it look like in 5 to 7 years? And, I go back to, just to put it in context for folks, when I started in the 60s, I was a systems engineer with IBM. And the way development was done is you sat with the user. They said what they wanted. We wrote it down and went off and programmed it. Brought it back to them, and they said, well, I want this. Move this heading, do this, do that. It was a very intimate model. And then in the 70s, we started moving people out of the business location and created an IT organization, which was for career development and camaraderie and so forth. And well, we were still in the same building. We were just on a different floor generally. And then in the 80s, the building got so full that they chose usually to move IT out of the building, still in the same city, but maybe, a mile away. So you had to get in your car to see your business user. And it was very convenient because you were with your IT peers. Uh, and then things really got different in the 90s when we started offshoring. You no longer were in the same city, you were in another continent, right? And then finally, when COVID hit, regardless of where you were on the globe, everybody was virtual. And that's kind of where we are now. We got a lot of people on the business side all over the globe, on the IT side all over the globe, and we're looking for an intimate, agile development environment to work in because we're doing development more like we used to than we have done over the last 30 or 40 years. The intimacy model matters. So as you begin to think about where people are today, how work is done, and you start thinking about the future as to where, what, how many people, what kind of skills are you going to need? How do you think about the workforce of the future as a development leader? How do you even begin to think about the new form of development in the old form of organization structure?
Yeah, boy, it certainly is going to look differently, right? And I love hearkening back to those earlier days where you had greater intimacy, right? As a development leader who's really spent a lot of time implementing various methods to improve the quality of the delivery process. For me, the first kind of aha occurred in really in the early 2000s with the arrival of the Agile movement and the Agile Manifesto, right? The point of the Agile Manifesto was to do a couple of things. It was to emphasize the delivery, shipping code being currency, being the most important thing, the most important part of the process, but also the intimacy with our business customers to understand more directly what the business customer is looking for, or what a potential user is looking for in a particular solution that we might be writing code for, right? So the industry is undergoing I think a maturation, starting with those sorts of efforts in the early 2000s. And the challenge is now things are moving faster, right? And even though we have great productivity and the potential of productivity gains with things like AI, it really does take more people working together to get things done. So, as I think about the work of the future and the workforce of the future, I agree with you completely that we're really talking about the essence of cross-functional organizations and cross-functional teams where there are a few distinctions between what organization you might have come from in that organizational hierarchy, and more of a focus on how are we coming together to perform some useful, delivery, or create some useful new solution for customers who are even more demanding, right? So, customer demands are growing, business cycles are collapsing. These are all things that we talk about a lot. And I think now organizations need to respond with new ways of thinking about how they organize and operate.
Yeah, I think the thing that makes it interesting to pose this question to you as opposed to some of the other affiliates is you've also and are still living in startup worlds. And I think you just described a startup. Everybody, the intimacy of a startup group, the composite solutions that you guys come up with, the speed with which you move. Uh, but a lot of that has to do with the intimacy of being in a loft somewhere as opposed to being spread all over the globe. So you've lived in both worlds.
Yeah, yeah. And to that point, right, again, I've also been in startups that have scaled, from a couple of teams to tens of teams or hundreds of teams. And the idea of scaling up, this sort of model that starts off with intimacy, you really have to, be thoughtful in terms of how you add process around and support around this organizationally to make sure that as you grow the number of people or teams that are interacting to deliver something useful, that they're staying in the proper formation and are equipped with common points of view so that you're not worried about whether they're heading in the right direction or not, right? I mean, we've talked a lot even in the lifespan of our TLD classes, the idea that agile practices are great, but it makes it easier to develop the wrong thing faster, right? And now that's exacerbated with techniques are emerging like Gen AI techniques or agents or other sorts of AI assisted development and delivery, where we can even move faster to develop the wrong thing if we don't have the right frame of reference and the right guardrails that are supporting teams as they're doing their work to make sure that they're delivering the right thing.
Yeah, I think the thing that caught my ear was this notion of scaling up. How would you think about scaling down from thousands of people all over the place to bring things together? In other words, take what startups do in terms of scaling up. How do you scale back in a world where you're built kind of for World War II? You're not built for, you know, up and down the street fighting.
Sure, sure. Yeah, so a lot of that has to do with eliminating silos, right? I mean, what tends to happen when we scale up is we get into our worlds and we don't look across at what's happening in other parts of the organization or other parts of the business. And so as you think about scaling down, I think the first thing you have to deal with is the idea that as you are scaling down, you're creating intimacy and cross connections in organizations that used to be very distinct, right? So you might have a QA organization separate from a development organization, and now those organizations are really coming together in terms of practices, especially with the introduction of AI. And then those teams are now having to come into close alignment with business teams that, until we brought those organizations together in some meaningful ways. And that's where I think the in motion organization really matters here in terms of how we organize these cross-functional teams that could be coming from different places, to ensure that they have the right channels and avenues of communication so that they're operating in synchronization, right? And not operating in kind of isolated ways.
But you still see within the IT group the need for each function, but they would come together
Right. Yeah,
for the
because
multiple
you need
functions
that
to
care and
create a,
feeding, right? Yeah, you need the point of this really is that we're talking about and between what we might describe as a classic, the organization, the organizational hierarchy and the organization that's in motion, right? So the organizational hierarchy still has immense value in terms of ensuring that we've got the right skills, that we have common practice within a skill area. And then, the emotion sort of thinking is more about how do we how do we combine these into effective teams that bring a complement of skill sets and perspective, right?
yeah. Yeah, it feels like in our world, the trifecta of business architects, technical architects, and planners need to be putting together teams. It's almost like you're composing a symphony when you're creating these cross-functional composite solutions. And somebody's got to sit there and say, how many violins, how many cellos, how
Right.
many for this particular piece of work, right? And, a lot of that starts flowing into the operating model. So, when you think about the current organization and operating model, it's very built around projects, annual plans, right? Long running efforts as opposed to agile teams coming together
Right.
to build a solution, and then a different component is built by the next PIs or the next releases as you go forward. This is where you know we've got to almost start with a blank sheet of paper, and it's a little bit of Back to the Future. It feels like that. We got to have, and the same thing's true on the business side. Just because we need cross-functional integration, the supply chain or order to cash or any of those that touches all these different functions, right? We still need functional excellence. We still need people in an airline that know how to fix a plane, maintain it, know how to fly a plane, people that take the baggage on and off the plane. So functional excellence still matters, but cross-functional integration matters, and we have analogies to that with security, infrastructure engineering, compliance. I mean, we have a lot of strong engineering functional needs. At the same time, a lot of need to bring people together, and I'm not sure it's getting a lot of attention right now. I think the business architecture and the technical architecture and the economics are, but not so much the organization and the operating model in this AI world.
Yeah, agreed. And this, we were talking a little bit in the setup for our conversation this morning about the article that we created around Team of Teams, which was General McChrystal's kind of encapsulation of this new way of thinking about organizations. And one of the things he brings out, which I think is really valuable in this conversation, is that an organization is really operating in kind of three different tempos or rhythms at the same time, right? There's the strategic rhythm, right, which is the longer term, what's my North Star, but even how is that North Star changing and evolving over time? And that's typically on some long multi-month time horizon, right? And then in the middle, there's the operational rhythm, right? And that's the day to day, week to week, how are we delivering things? Where are teams at? Those sorts of things. And at the working level, there's the tactical rhythm, right? And that could be an intraday. I'm getting ready to make a delivery. This delivery is part of a continuous delivery that involves multiple teams, or we have to inform our business stakeholders about new features that are coming and make sure that we're connected to them as we're releasing new capabilities, right? And so I think the operating model has to accommodate that kind of variety of kind of wide gauge thinking to very narrow and at the point of attack sort of thinking to really be effective today, right? If we have disconnects between those things, we used to describe the difference between planning, building, and running, and the visuals never gave justice to the idea that that was a continuous process, that we were not done planning or we were not done running, right? That these are active these are things that are active that are happening over time in response to new things that are occurring in the world in which we operate or in the worlds in which our company operate, right? So it's really that dynamic between those things, I think, that have to be reflected in the operating model and then also reflected in the way that we equip people from the organizational model perspective.
Yeah, and it feels like in the decades where we've gotten physically further apart between IT and the business, and then within IT, between continents and functions, that there's going to have to be a massive piece of transformation that's focused on the organization transformation from to. Because the intellectual part of what you just said is easy to get. I get that you're taking people from here and people from there, and they're going to have a shared way of doing things. And, you're going to need, like in McChrystal's term, a piece of the Air Force, a piece of the Navy to do a mission, right? But when the cultures have been fragmented by business unit separation, continents, languages, time zones, getting the kind of intimacy that I'm not saying it can't be done, right? It won't be done unless there's active attention to what does this need to look like in 5 years?
Yeah, and I think that's the key point, right? I mean, all of us are, speaking for myself, I guess, I've grown up with a strong sense of how an organization is composed, what layers and spans are, how I think about my teams in terms of the skill sets and do I have the right people in the right roles in the right place. And now, I think the new attention needs to be we need to start to define, what are the best practices for the way we operate the teams that are in motion, right? The number of places I've been where they have teams up and running, right? They're committed to agile practices. We've talked a little bit about scaled agile, right, as a methodology that really I think has a great foundation, a set of lean principles for operating teams at scale, still without the right attention to am I composed in the right way? Do I have the right people being focused on something more than just agile ceremonies or what's my burn down chart look like in this sprint? On the focusing on the bigger picture of how those teams are relating to each other is really key. And I've been in organizations with numbers of teams, and the leaders can't even describe how many teams they actually have in the organization, right? Because our thinking and our tool set is not really focused on supporting and managing teams in that way. So I think that's one area that we would see some real need for maturation first in the way that we practice.
Yeah. And, I think we would agree that our number one job is to run the business every day, right? And it just feels a little uncomfortable that that is a very rigid, structured thing with change windows and everything else, battling all of the change the business steam that's coming. I could see being there with the business architecture and the technical architecture and the economics because people will tend to that. I think we're getting to that point where people understand platforms and capabilities and data and all that. But I think there's not enough attention being paid to the organization of the future, the leadership, the culture, the workforce. And as you talk about it so elegantly, putting it in motion is the operating model, right? How do we do our work has to change, but it has to change in a measured way because we still have to run everything we have.
Yeah, exactly. Well, again, you can't turn a battleship in one, in one fell swoop either, right? So I think, evolving the way that we implement operating models in my experience, it starts with getting explicit about some of these things that are very tacit, right? We talk about culture or we talk about the tacit organizational model, and so step one in the consulting work I do is to help organizations really start getting something they can feel, touch, and respond to, that relates to these practices, right? A great example, Charlie, that we talk about a lot is the importance of enterprise architecture. But the number of places that we've been that enterprise architecture might be one person sitting in a corner somewhere, right? It's not an essential, relatable sort of function that I think is required to operate a technology function in this modern world that we're grappling with this morning, right? The idea that um, of reason of incorporating architectural thinking, if we think about those time horizons that I talked about earlier, as getting ahead of where teams actually are in the work, it becomes really essential. They've got to plow the ground, right? That then other teams can use to actually deliver value effectively. And yet, it's a very underthought function today. The number of places that we've leaders that we've interacted with that recognize its value, but allocating the attention and the time span, to really working out what that means for that organization is often just not front of mind. It's not as critical as that delivery that's got to get done today, or the incident that we're responding to that we need to resolve, or what have you.
Yeah, and I think that goes all the way through from the enterprise to the domain, right? To the solution, to the team leads. It's not just architects, it's planners, it's the coordination function. I like the term you use with McChrystal around, I forget what it is, kind of watching after things.
Yeah, eyes on, hands off.
Yeah, yeah. How do you keep the eyes on? How do you keep the threads going? How do you keep um, the flow of work so it never stops for the teams, but they fit together from the top of the enterprise at the strategic level to the domains or functions to the solutions to the actual code into the process. And so it's I think when we talk about enterprise architecture, people think about the geniuses at the top that are sitting there watching. No. It's enterprise meaning layers of architects, layers of planners, layers of people that are signed up to produce the value, right? I mean, sooner you've got to make sure that the value happens, right? And how do you extract that? Because as we go into this next era, the amount of change on the business side is going to be 3 times what the amount of change is on the IT side from a workforce point of view,
You bet.
right? And that's why I keep saying the HR function is very critical going forward to make sure that we don't just write the code, but that the workforce can consume it, that they're trained, that they understand what it's meant to do and how, their jobs are changing. That's a big part of this. And I think that, like I said, I think we're going to figure out the technology a lot quicker than we're going to figure out the human side of all of this. But it's critical. We got to get that model cranking.
Yeah, and the human side, to me, is the to your point, is the long pole in the tent, which is why, as a technologist,
Hmm.
this area to me is very compelling, right? To equip leaders with new ways of thinking that
Hmm.
can help them, because we can't solve problems we haven't labeled, right? But we can solve things that we've labeled, that we've defined. This is a lot of the work that we do, and when we advise customers to develop a robust current state or a cube, right? Is that
Hmm.
what we're really trying to do is to understand, where are all the connection points here, and what are all the variables that we're dealing with, so that then we can solve for forward. And to your point, we're going to have fewer people potentially, in these organizations. Every seat is going to be important. And so we want to make sure that people are properly equipped and in the right places to have the positive effect. Because if they're not having the positive effect, they're going to have a negative effect, right?
Right.
We're not going to have many coasters here, I think, in the future.
Well, I think that I know you personally have been passionate about this. And you had mentioned as we were getting on that you're working on a blog or an article
Yeah, an article.
about organizations at rest and in motion. And I think it'd be great if, when that comes out, if we could, make the community aware of it because it's such a complicated topic. People are changing their organizations now, but there's so much fixed structure in place where they are, how many people they have, how many contractors versus how many
Right.
employees, how many architects versus how many developers versus how many project managers versus product managers. I mean, the whole thing needs to be configured, but it's over time. So you've got to have a picture of what this will look like in 5 years, right? And I love the idea of functional or the organization from a structural point of view at rest versus the organization at motion when now we got to go do some work and it's going to take these 12 people from the business community from different functions and these 50 people from technology, some of them architects, some of them software engineers, infrastructure, some of them consulting teams and you know vendors and providers. It's going to be a mix, but it's when you put it in motion, it's got to have some way of culturally staying together. So leadership matters a lot, and culture is going to matter a lot going forward. So hopefully you'll include some of those, and as we put that article out, I'd love to hear from our community because some companies have got to be ahead of others in solving this particular vector. Some of our community as an active HR group and leadership group that's worrying about, not just in IT, but as a company, what is the workforce going to look like in 5 years of the AI world?
Yeah, agreed. Again, we know things are moving faster, right? That's part of the motivation here, and they're getting more automated. That's part of what AI is bringing to the table. And so integration is going to be even more important, right? I mean, we can't have, what I love about the metaphor you're bringing to the table today is the idea that we're sitting in the same room with the business as the business is determining its future. And the idea of getting back to that form of intimacy, again, has been a part of the Agile movement since the early 2000s, right, as a goal. But we may be finally on at the point where we can actually solve that goal in a real and meaningful way, right? And not look at the business from a distance, or talk about it in kind of order taker sorts of terms. When the business tells me what they want to do, I'll implement it. It's more of a co-authorship, I think, that we're really trying to achieve as we drive forward with this new workforce.
Yeah, I think when you start finishing each other's sentences, right, is when you've hit that point of collaboration that's so important, because in a lot of cases, the business doesn't know what's possible. In a lot of cases, we don't know what they need, right? But now it's really gotten even more complicated, because that was function to function, a domain to domain. Now almost everything is cross functions. You got to have peripheral vision too. So, which is why I think the team of teams, McChrystal's model, is a good beginning to begin to think about how do you take your resources and apply them to a problem. Right?
Yeah, and the other thing that McChrystal brings up that I think is really critical to our conversation is the nature of leadership, right? So really thinking of leaders again. That one great soundbite from Crystal is eyes on, hands off. The other really is that the leader's function is to tend the garden, right? Is to ensure that they have the right talent, the right teams, the right mix of communication, to especially accomplish the bigger things that the organization wants to do. It's one thing to do it at the team level. It's another thing to do it at the team of teams level. And so there's clearly a leadership mandate. And I know through COVID, there was kind of a confusion about what managers do in these distributed models and that sort of thing. And I think managers and leaders have an essential role, as really preparers of the organization so that it can accomplish great things, but not necessarily command and control, not necessarily having to tell an individual team, here's how you need to do things, right? Unless it's a teaching situation, right?
Yeah, but that's not going to happen without leadership development.
Right, exactly.
People just, this is so different, right? And so I think the models of the old GE Crotonville and IBM and PepsiCo leadership development, we're going to have to make these investments in the future. So, JR, when the article comes out, we'll make sure everybody in the community gets a heads up that it's out there. And again, I would invite anybody listening to this, if they feel like they've got some ideas that they can contribute,
Yeah.
because everybody is struggling with this right now. So,
Yeah, and I'd love to hear of any of our alumni or that are working through that right now, right? Because again, this is new ground, I think, for all organizations. I'm not sure there's certainly not an established way of doing things here, but I think we're starting to see the emergence of things that can help leaders and organizations kind of become equipped so that they can really deal with both sides of their equation, right? The at rest and the emotion piece.
okay, well, I really appreciate the time today.
Thanks, Charlie.